If we can get those numbers down, I'm going to give you my plans for the future, okay? In the past, Microsoft, we've gone soft. I want to get those numbers down, and so what I want to propose is, it's time to go hard. It's time to go micro hard. If you have a micro issue out there, a lot of you guys, if you're in the micro, those numbers are going down. We need to get those numbers down. I'm going to propose a solution for everyone. Microsoft is going to go micro hard, and we're going to allow you to download into our databases, okay? If you take the Stabby, if you get the little quantum dot, here we have the average teen, and I'm going to call this program Teen Disk. Allow me to download you onto what we call the future. This little gadget here is what we call the future. In the near future, every teen will be able to be squeezed onto this little, what we call a thumb drive or a zip drive. Now, if you don't have access to the quantum Bitcoin funds that we are going to have access to give you, there's also the future that's called a DVD disc or laser disc. If we could get these numbers down, I'm going to corner the market on allowing teens to be downloaded onto DVD discs. At that point, what we can then do is simply delete the teens that we don't like in the future. And you can also be put into any virtual matrix that you so choose. Perhaps you want to be in an entire universe perhaps that's where you ought to be. And in that universe, I'm still going to be God. But I'm going to keep those numbers down. And then what you'll have is basically a credit system where you can live out your life on the disk, perhaps Laserdisc as well for the low-income families. If we can get those numbers down, I'm going to give you my plans for the future, okay? In the past, Microsoft, we've gone soft. I want to get those numbers down, and so what I want to propose is, it's time to go hard. It's time to go micro hard. If you have a micro issue out there, a lot of you guys, if you're in the micro, those numbers are going down. We need to get those numbers down. I'm going to propose a solution for everyone. Microsoft is going to go micro hard, and we're going to allow you to download into our databases, okay? If you take the Stabby, if you get the little quantum dot, here we have the average teen, and I'm going to call this program Teen Disk. Allow me to download you onto what we call the future. This little gadget here is what we call the future. In the near future, every teen will be able to be squeezed onto this little, what we call a thumb drive or a zip drive. Now, if you don't have access to the quantum Bitcoin funds that we are going to have access to give you, there's also the future that's called a DVD disc or laser disc. If we can get these numbers down, I'm going to corner the market on allowing teens to be downloaded onto DVD discs. At that point, what we can then do is simply delete the teens that we don't like in the future. And you can also be put into any virtual matrix that you so choose. Perhaps you want to be in an entire universe perhaps that's where you ought to be. And in that universe, I'm still going to be God. But I'm going to keep those numbers down. And then what you'll have is basically a credit system where you can live out your life on the disk, perhaps Laserdisc as well for the low-income families. It's all fun and games until Gill Bates shows up. what I want to talk about now is more serious. One of the key figures that is in that power structure with Gill Bates is the character of Mr. David Rockefeller. Now, there's two key books that we haven't delved into extensively in the Globalism book series, just because they're pretty dense, pretty heavy, pretty fat. I have read them over the years. I've read a significant portion of them. They're both about combined 1,300, 1,500 pages. So they may be next up on the docket for the Globalism Books talks, but I think this one might be out of print, but The Rockefellers: An American Dynasty by Collier and Horowitz is one of the most important books for understanding the system and how it works and the power structure, the families behind it. Now, this is an authorized biography, right? And yes, that's the David Horowitz that you've probably heard of. And so this kind of traces the history of this family and their dynasty in the U.S. and their attitude. But what I wanted to point out was that while not written as any kind of expose, the book is extremely revelatory. And again, if we understand that this was written as a book that is intended to be read by people in the system, it's an academic work, it's a gigantic history. It's not about exposing, it's not a conspiracy text. It's, again, an authorized biography. And so it was written on the basis of the archives, right? They are one of, if not the most powerful family, I would argue, in America, at least in the 20th century. And there's a few really stellar points that stand out in the book. Now, you may know that the University of Chicago, American Medical Association, American Psychiatric Association, all these different medical entities and social entities, universities, many of these universities now receive money from these foundations. This is the real power structure, is these foundations. They're more powerful than government. They are in the background. They're able to throw money around in order to have influence. And so if we start at the beginning of this book, what we notice is that even back in the late 1800s, members of the family did have an intense interest in weird occult stuff. In fact, one of the daughters, this is on page 73, went to study under Carl Jung, and she became convinced that she was the reincarnation of Akhenaten, the child bride of Pharaoh. Was this some sort of mind control thing? Was this what she really thought? I don't know. But she came to the conclusion after her Jungian bizarre experiences that that's who she was. So I think that we can begin to see that there's something off here, right? When we look at page 134, we see the connections between the Council on Foreign Relations, the houses of J.P. Morgan, Woodrow Wilson, right? If you're familiar with Colonel Edwin Mandel House, this is verified. It's verified very clearly, page 134, that the CFR, its beginning in 1921, which is one of the key power structures in the U.S., comes out of the money and power of this family. Early on as well, in the next few pages, we read about the National Park Services. We read about the ecumenist movement and the push for a one world religion, as well as the support of Billy Graham and Junior's goal for a one world government, which I tweeted out, or one world religion that ties into this one world government that I tweeted yesterday. If you want to see my Twitter, where I actually show you the screenshots, you can go to my Twitter below. $75 million back in this 1930s money was put into the altering of ideas of what religion is to create a pseudo-global religion. Back then, that's a huge amount of money. In fact, they even created their own church, Riverside Church, with statues dedicated to the figures of Confucius, Moses, Hegel, Dante, Muhammad, and Darwin. Then we find that the money is channeled into these big entities like the National Council of Churches, and of course later on the World Council of Churches. So early on, the family had a very intense interest in religious projects and steering religious projects. If you're familiar with my lectures on tragedy and hope, this is a book that's in that vein. And so later on, Bohemian Grove comes up on page 237, where David Rockefeller attends Bohemian Grove.
We should also add that the origins of the OSS and the CIA, if you've read Servando Gonzalez's excellent treatise, his intelligence analysis, psychological warfare in the New World Order, you'll know that that's essentially where the OSS, the CIA come from. You could argue that they are a kind of private army for the Rockefeller family. That's more or less borne out in the Collier and Horowitz text. In fact, it even backs up on page 273 the connection between Colonel Edwin Mandell House as the handler for Woodrow Wilson at the behest of these more powerful families and groups. That's stated in this section here, and that the CIA was placed under the jurisdiction of the National Security Council, and that I would argue that in the background, you have these higher level groups that are actually running things like the CIA. So even people at the CIA don't know exactly the origin or the higher level geostrategies that are going on here, things that are planned by these big, powerful NGOs, Rand Corporation, Brookings Institute, Carnegie Endowment, right? These are the real power structure. I've done many videos on that over the years. Now, next in chapter 16, we get into big, powerful banking interests. Kuhn, Loeb, Lazare-Frères, de Beauvoir, Plimpton, Milbank, Tweed, Rockefeller Foundation, CFR, all tied into Republican Party at this point, and a whole list of important, powerful players and CFR people like John J. McCloy, powerful people like the Dulles brothers. They're all allied here in these think tanks under Rockefeller power. And says, in fact, it notes all of these think tanks, the Rockefeller Foundation had a key role in creating. You see that? The environmental, social, political, financial fabric in which this family moved was vast in scope. And in fact, chapter 16 even notes that we talk of this as a conspiracy. One can see why it's conceived of as perhaps a conspiracy because of the extent of the power and influence. Another book I want to call attention to is just the frank admissions in something like David Rockefeller's own memoirs. You've seen me quote many times probably in the past the 1979 editorial of David Rockefeller on how Maoism was such a great thing for China and how he's a fan of Maoism and Maoist regimes. You'll notice many meetings in this book between David Rockefeller and all of these Soviets and communists, Mandela, Khrushchev. Understand that rich people meet other powerful people, but keep in mind that we're supposed to believe that there's this powerful warfare going on between capitalism and communism. And yet we have David Rockefeller being involved in the passing of NAFTA, David Rockefeller being involved in working with Nelson Mandela. It doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense until we get to the chapter of the open door policy on page 258, 259, where China was built up by the West. And that this new openness allowed for the openness to the West, allowed for Chase Bank to be set up in China. So it's really, communism is about these kinds of things. And if we want to understand how this all came to be, we have to understand that David Rockefeller early on in this book talks about how he learned all this when he worked as an intelligence agent. He worked in intelligence. And you could look again at his family as sort of a giant, vast intelligence network. That's why we get the famous quote on chapter 27 about the proud internationalist, where he says famously that some people say that all this is a conspiracy. He says, sure, I have no problem admitting that I'm at the table to create a global government. I'm here to do this. I am proud of it, he says on page 405. And so then we have explanations after that as to why he would be meeting with Castro, why he would be involved in the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, the IMF, passing NAFTA, Council on Foreign Relations, all these international institutes, NGOs. And that even as we learn in, I didn't mention it, but in the chapter, there's a whole chapter on feminism and Abby Rockefeller promoting third wave feminism at the University of Chicago, and that she put a lot of money back in the 70s into that movement. But you'll notice here that we have Opus Dei. We have its connections to the CIA, to these global institutions. We have the idea of networks being created through these NGOs, and that this is how the world is run. He says, I was able to do this because I was formerly an intelligence officer in World War II, and I learned my effectiveness to depend on the ability to develop networks and to then relay information that's reliable and thus to influence people. He says, I am a proud internationalist in this regard. That's on page 418. So there you can see that what we're dealing with here is not something hidden. It's actually out in the open. It's from the writings of the most powerful people in the world themselves, where they openly say what they're up to, and they count on people not reading, not being open to being corrected. I've had so many people over the years. I mean, now all of this is happening. People are starting to notice that what I've been talking about is real. I've been talking about this. I learned about this when I was 18. So almost 20 years of knowing about these things, learning more and more, putting more of the pieces of the puzzle together. And what you come to realize is that espionage, conspiracy basically leads you into the realm of espionage and studying how operations like that are run. And then when you study that, you learn about geopolitics, right? And then you learn about history. So this is really the norm of history. These are not aberrations. This is the norm in the sense of geopolitical machinations, right? Countries going to war against countries. But what's unique to our present period is that all these people that we've mentioned, the Kissingers, the Brzezinskis, the Rockefellers, their attitude is unique and different from the ancient world and its dictators and tyrants. Their attitude is that of technocracy. They actually believe that now technology has advanced to the degree that it can run everything. We can literally construct a completely technocratic world order and world government. Everything can be centralized, unified, homogenized. And so that's what is the ultimate big scale explanation, at least in terms of history and geopolitics, of everything that's happening. Everything that's happened in the last several hundred years and everything that's happening right now is explained by that. Now, that's just in the human domain. In the spiritual sense, it obviously goes much deeper. I just did a video last week on that, the cosmic battle. You can go watch that video if you want to see the spiritual dimension. But in the human dimension, it's all about this. And it's all been written about for the last 100 years over and over and over. So I hope you like this video. Shout out to Aaron and Melissa. They put Gill Bates and me as Gill Bates in their most recent video. Be sure and go check out Who's Here to Rescue Us that they just put out this week. And if you like this video, be sure to subscribe and so forth down below. Buy my book at my website. You can get signed copies of Esoteric Hollywood 1 and 2. And subscribe and join below for more of the content for members only. Thank you.